Greetings, Starfighters. Welcome to the last regular season episode of Shameless Cashgrab. Today we are looking at a movie called The Executioner from 1970, starring George Peppard from the A-Team TV series, which, oddly enough, I was never really a fan of. For me, the A-Team was always just that show that was like on... okay, I'm trying to think back like over 30 years here, so bear with me. I think it was between original Battlestar Galactica and the Adam West Batman, or yeah. For the longest time, the only thing that ever really stuck about me was like, oh yeah, hey, Starbuck is in that too. I liked the movie though, which is weird, but okay. Total tangent. The movie with Liam Neeson and Bradley Cooper from 2010. I know a lot of people hate that. Maybe the fact that I didn't like the TV show was a plus in that instance. Okay, again, off topic. Initially, when I saw this title on here and the logo, I had a feeling that this was going to be based off of this series of books that, heck, maybe it's still in print. Maybe it's one of those series that keeps going with the same author's name on it, even though the author has been dead for years. About a character named Mac Bolan. I remember seeing those books everywhere when I was a kid. Like every supermarket that would have like novels with the magazines over in the greeting card aisle and all that. I'd see them there. I think maybe my grandpa had some of those novels, but like I never read any of them. Literally, all I know about it is that the series is called The Executioner, and the main character was named Mac Bolan. I thought maybe that this was a movie based on those novels, but it doesn't look like it because they provide character names on the back in the plot summary here, and none of those names are Mac Bolan. So that honestly lets me off the hook there, because if I was covering it, I imagine that some people would have expected me to. Actually, why would you have expected me to compare and contrast? Because at no point have I ever tried to compare any of the movies on, not just in this season, but in the show in general, that have been based on books to the books, seeing as I've never read those books. I've never covered a movie based on a book I've read on this show, and probably never will. The movies I've seen that are based on books I've read tend to be way too popular to end up in Mill Creek sets. So, yeah, I'm doing the rambling thing again. But as an aside, if you're interested at all in a YouTube show that focuses on movies based on books, show called Lost in Adaptation, hosted by Dominic Noble. I actually support him on Patreon. So, yeah, go ahead and check that out after you have watched me talking about The Executioner from 1970, starring George Peppard.
Okay, so I have now watched The Executioner from 1970. Plot summary courtesy of IMDb. Explosive international intrigue results when British intelligence agent John Shea suspects Adam Booth, a colleague, of being a double agent. Although Shea's superiors warn him against an investigation, he travels to Greece and Turkey in order to check out his suspicions. There, Shea becomes involved with the beautiful Sarah, who was once his lover and is now Booth's wife. Before long, Shea realizes being used as a communist pawn, I did not write that, and has fallen into grave danger. Couple of things to note up here. Judy Geeson, who played the stalker/love interest in the last movie, returns for this one. Different character, of course. And this film also co-stars Joan Collins. Yes, the one from City on the Edge of Forever. Actually, in it surprisingly little, given that they gave her, like, second or third billing in the credits, but... Oh, and I realized I forgot to put this in the script, so, for clarification... They explain George Peppard's lack of a British accent by having his character have been born there, but having been brought to the U.S. by his parents during the Blitz, or World War II, and he didn't go back until he was an adult. I'm willing to bet that they had him try to do a British accent in auditions and then just decided it wasn't working, and I can think of a lot of movies that I wish had taken that tack, but, we're not talking about any of those. We're talking about The Executioner. So our movie wastes no time getting into the serious stuff, as before we even get a title, we see a dead man in a car that's been shot to shit and is also on fire. The camera pulling back slowly, the noise, a mix of score, and the continuous blare of the car horn. The camera then pans to a man in a suit holding a rifle, looking at a totally different car that's also been shot up and has a couple of dead bodies slumped out of its doors. He walks by a house where there's yet another body in the driveway, and he watches as someone carrying another body is walking away. The shot then cuts to yet another body in an empty pool as the credits start. I am so resisting the urge to put in a clip from that Drowning Pool song right now. I mean, I'm not above the on-the-nose jokes, but, well, that's a song, and you know how YouTube copyright bots can be. In fact, that body in the pool is the one you saw in the first screen cap of the episode, because that's where they put the title of the movie. So we see one more body before we get to George Peppard's character, John Shea from the summary, who was the one walking while carrying someone. Turns out he wasn't carrying a dead body, though, but a wounded Joan Collins. This would be the Sarah from the plot summary. A brief flashback interrupts the walk, and I do mean brief. It's about a couple of seconds with no dialogue, and you can't even clearly see their faces, though this is probably meant to be younger versions of these two characters. A third person is shown to be walking around the grounds of this house where a major shootout has taken place, and then a car explodes. It cuts from that to John taking Sarah inside the house and laying her down on a small piece of furniture while he makes a tourniquet for her out of his own shirt. Well, part of his shirt, anyway. This leads to another brief flashback. This one, like the other I just mentioned, is accompanied by sparkles. Yes, sparkles. This flashback is also in slow-mo for some reason. John tries to tend to Sarah's wound, but she yells at him, simply saying, "You killed him, what kind of animal are you?" Which leads to yet another flashback, or rather two very quick flashbacks in quick succession. And by the way, all of these flashbacks have happened in just the first 5.5 minutes of the movie, and that 5.5 minutes includes the Columbia Pictures intro. This is not promising. Showing us the end of the movie first and then the rest in flashback is certainly a valid way to make a movie, and there have been several that have pulled it off very well. I don't think this one's going to be one of them. John says, "You didn't know," or "You didn't care," and then we get another flashback, this one tinted green and taking place in a morgue. And also, that line does not really make much sense, given what happens once we loop back to this part, but we'll get there. Oh, by the way, we get another flashback to that same morgue after the first flashback, the one that was tainted green. And if the whole movie is going to be like this is going to be a short episode, because I imagine I'll get tired of listing the flashbacks pretty damn quick. At least this particular flashback is longer than a few seconds, though that's because part of it literally repeats several times, and no, it wasn't a problem with the DVD I checked. This movie has barely even started, and it's already lost my interest. But the last flashback has brought us into the movie proper, finally, as the color grading and speed return to normal, and we have John telling a local detective that the body he's been shown is not the person they think she might be. The detective rambles on a bit as the two leave, and John heads back to where he's staying, which we were shown more of than I think we needed, the trip. And he nearly assaults an associate of his who makes the mistake of approaching from behind in a darkened hallway. The man, clearly panicking as John checks to see if anyone is sticking out his place through the window, tells John he knows he shouldn't have come, but that he tried to contact someone named Vilma. Vilma, it turns out, was the body that John had just seen in the morgue, and he'd actually lied to the detective. The two talk more about how their operation has been compromised and that someone clearly talked, but they argue about who. John breaks out some device that I couldn't even begin to describe in the moment to try and contact the person the associate thinks talked, arguing that if he's the one, he'd try and drag out any conversation to buy time for any assassins. And if there's no reply whatsoever, he's not only not the one who gave them up, but is also likely dead. The device, it turns out, is some sort of Morse code kind of thing, and John does get a reply, but all it says is, alert. And the associate spots a car pulling up outside with 2 men in suits getting out, and warns John about it. An unknown third man walks up to the 2 suited men and points right at the window. John and his associate manage to sneak their way past the 2 suited agents, but run into the third man who walked into the building brandishing a gun. John takes him out with a few punches before throwing him over the railing to his death. This sequence is actually pretty tense, a major improvement over the opening of the film. My confidence is rising somewhat. The 2 get away, and we cut to a train station. John drops the associate off there, and for the record, he does say this man's name, but I couldn't make it out, and there's no captions on this DVD set. Judy Geeson enters the movie at this point, picking up John at Heathrow. The 2 are a couple, though she doesn't seem to know what John actually does for a living. Her name is Polly, by the way. He reads a newspaper article as she drives that suggests the guy who he'd insisted hadn't been compromised because he gave John a warning to get out actually was compromised anyway. And, it occurs to me, the way I do this show and the spy thriller genre are not really compatible, are they? Or perhaps films with a mystery element altogether. To be honest, when I'm watching a movie like this, just for myself, not for the show, I'm not one of those people who tries to solve the mystery before the main character does. I just go along for the ride. John and Polly go straight from the airport to a party being thrown by the Booth couple. That name you might recognize from the plot summary. A game of cricket is being played, and Sarah spots them and waves. Polly looks less than thrilled about this, and then we get a flashback. Shame, we'd gone a good 13 minutes without one of those. Those sparkles are back, which are honestly distracting. To be fair...
To be fair...
The effect itself is not the issue. It just feels like it would be a better fit for a flashback sequence in a movie geared towards families or even just young girls. Anyway, the 2 couples start to interact after Adam Booth loses, I guess, at the cricket game after being distracted at seeing John talking to Sarah. I had to pick this up from context clues because I don't know how cricket works and you can't make me. John and Adam walk off the grounds into the house where they meet up with a man playing pool, and it's the criminologist from Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
No matter what else I see this guy in, that's the role I always think of. As for this movie, Vaughn Jones is the character's name. He keeps John and Adam waiting before bothering to speak to them, starting with a lecture about patience before getting to why he wanted to see them. And it's about Grubner, the name of the guy who is suspected to have been compromised and given up John's spy cell. John apparently still believes he didn't do it, but his superiors are convinced otherwise. See, this is why my show's format is ill-suited for this kind of movie. Every time I think I've described a previous scene accurately, I get new context that makes me doubt if I'm properly conveying this movie to my audience. I'm so glad I don't have spy movies in the season 11 set. Or at least I don't think I... Okay, a couple of mysteries, but no spy movies, but then again, that might not necessarily be better. Well. Moving on, John is convinced that the real double agent is someone high up in London, but his superiors don't want to hear it and laugh at the very idea. Adam's reaction is a dead giveaway, and it's fortunate that John was facing in the opposite direction, or this would be a very short movie. Unless he already suspects Adam and just hasn't told us yet. Either I need to implement a no spy movies rule for this show, or I may have to actually start watching these movies twice like the professionals do. Regardless, the sequence ends with the other old white guy in the room besides Vaughn declaring the Operation Pinball, to be failed and closed. In the next scene, we have Adam getting drunk and being a dick to his wife. After that, we follow John and Polly back to their place. Well, I guess it's just her place, because she mentions not having invited him up. Guess she's a bit salty about John having talked, very briefly I should add, to Sarah at the party. Before driving off, John asks Polly to compile a list of everyone connected with Operation Pinball, so I guess they work together as well, and she does know what he does for a living. And they are openly dating while working together. I feel like even in 1970 that wouldn't fly, but what do I know? We go from there to John returning to his London home, where someone is watching him from their car, and then to him being flown over a research lab in a small plane, and then we go into the lab itself. Maybe it's just me, but I'm not sure we needed the flyover, but that's hardly the first bit of this movie that's felt like padding. At the lab, John is talking to someone. We're not entirely sure who, but he and his lab is working on some kind of fuel that they hope to provide/sell to the Americans for the space race. John tells him to keep quiet about it, which I think he's a professor, so I'll call him that. The professor finds it all a bit odd. We then follow Polly as she meets with John at a pub and provides him the list he wanted. He asks her about how many files have been marked as failed and closed in the past 5 years. When Polly says 10 or 11, she realizes he's about to ask her to get him those files, which leads to an argument about how he needs her because no one will give him clearance. In a fairly crowded pub. Smooth. He apologizes, however, and in what I think was supposed to be a joke, we go from Polly insisting that she's not a pushover to a montage of her getting the files for him anyway, though only one at a time over the course of several days. The problem with this sequence is that it isn't really clear right away that that's what's happening. It's not exactly original to do the character says they won't do a thing, then jump cut to them doing the thing bit, but it gets the point across, and it can be funny. Emphasis on can, not is, because it isn't here. Here we spend a little bit more time after she says she's not a pushover. Then we go to Polly's place where she offers to cook for John as he reads a file. I'd assumed that this was the list that Polly had already gotten for him before the argument. It's only once a montage of John reading files comes in that I realized differently. The montage sequence, which was well made, credit where credit is due, comes to an end with John and Polly in bed together, and John says that the same 2 names kept coming up on the files of failed operations, and one of the 2 had retired before Pinball had been cooked up, which leaves John with only one suspect, Adam Booth. We go back to the 2 old men from earlier, watching some film, surveillance film, not a movie, and John comes in, and they apparently were aware of Polly taking the files, and they lay into him about it, though he points out that if they truly believed he was going to sell them to a foreign power, he'd already have been arrested. Despite this, they still refuse to listen to him about why he did it, and suspend him pending a committee hearing. We go from here to John and Polly, who was also suspended on a date. So I guess she took that surprisingly well. What she doesn't take well is John spotting Sarah also at the restaurant with, actually the professor from the research lab. During her kind of possessive rant, which does not endear me to her at all, though John is little better with an implied threat of violence over it, Polly name drops a Soviet spy John is aware of by name who had recently defected. He asks her if she knows where he is, and she says Istanbul. I hope you all appreciate how much effort I'm putting into not making a They Might Be Giants joke right now. We immediately cut to Turkey, and John being driven to a large house. Here is where John meets the defecting Russian, who has said that there is a high-level leak in London, but the Americans interrogating him don't really buy it. John presses him for details, but assuming the Russian is telling the truth, he doesn't know any names beyond the Russian courier who collects the information from London to bring to Moscow. John decides to call this into his superiors, who tell him he had no right to do an interrogation, hang up on him, and then, in conversation, say they need to come up with some other way to get him off Booth's back, and imply they're going to either assassinate the Russian defector themselves, or provide an opportunity for the Russians to do it. Now, the obvious answer here is these 2 are also double agents, and Booth is working for them. Or this could be a misdirect, and they're hoping Booth will lead them to a bigger fish, and are worried John will fuck up that investigation. Admittedly, I'm leaning towards the latter at this moment, but we'll find out soon enough. So anyway, the Russian defector gets killed. A car bomb that also took out 2 American agents. And we fade cut to some British school children playing soccer. John is here following up on a name the Russian had given to him. A name that he knew had been fake, but also knew the origin of. While there, he finds a class photo of the boy whose name had been used by the double agent in London, a former student who had died nearly 30 years prior after his family had moved to South America. And on the back of a class photo that includes this student, we see the name of a kid standing just behind the student who had died 30 years prior, and it's Adam Booth. The names were included on the back. Wait, did I already say on the back? I wrote this paragraph so awkwardly. You guys have no idea. This is why I don't think I could ever pull off like an April Fool's joke where I write the script for the episode, but then ask somebody else to read it pretending to be me. Something I did on a podcast I used to do. Because I just am so bad at I go over these scripts to record, and I will see just these most awkwardly written sentences, and I have to try and figure out what the hell I meant at the time I wrote it. I was an English literature major in college. Anyway, John continues. Sorry about the tangent. John continues trying to convince his superiors, unaware of what the audience already knows. This does not go well, as you already know if you remember the plot summary I read at the start of this section. He is able to get a board of inquiry, but is sabotaged by Vaughn, who we see in a car with Booth. Though this doesn't entirely rule out the hoping Booth will lead them to a bigger fish theory. Why did I say story? That doesn't... Despite this, though, Adam's face gives away that he feels like things are about to go sideways for him. A pair of assassins attempt to ambush John in his garage when he arrives home, but he is able to take one of them out with his car and get away. He heads to Polly's, which I just know is going to end badly, and... Wait, is he wearing a different outfit when he gets to Polly's than he was in the car? And then she says something about worrying someone will try to kill him again. Okay, movie. You really did not do the best possible job of making it clear that these two events were not occurring the same night. Anyway, this is Polly's birthday, and John makes a valiant effort to stay with her the whole night. But 2 panic phone calls from who, as I was watching this, I had mistaken for a work colleague, ends up pulling him away. Maybe for the best, this relationship is kind of toxic. John arrives at the colleague's home to find Adam Booth unconscious on the floor. Philip, the guy's name is Philip, said he came home to find Booth going through his papers, so he clobbered him over the head and then injected him with a sedative. He says he tried to call Vaughn Jones, but got no answer, so he called John. There's still almost 45 minutes left in the movie, though, so either this is a trap or the climax is going to be a long one. And, I had to watch this movie over a couple of days due to a bit of scheduling issues, but I'm pretty sure we didn't have a front-loaded credit sequence for this movie, like most, if not all, of the other films this season. But even if this movie has its credits at the end, that's still more than a half hour of story. I wouldn't be surprised if Booth is somehow able to escape this. John decides that he's going to try and dispose of Booth and tells Philip that he doesn't trust his superiors. As someone watching this movie, I know he's right, but I'm not sure how he figured that out. He takes Booth out into a forest, ties his legs to something that looks like a car battery, and then, after a very brief and, again, sparkly flashback, shoots him. Oh, okay, so I was wrong about the escaping part, as Philip arrives in a small plane. John gets on the plane along with the body, and then another flashback, and it starts with John slapping Sarah, and not lightly either. Our hero, ladies and gentlemen. Sarah cries that she doesn't care what John says. She's going to marry him, the him presumably being Adam. John asks her why, and without being explicit about it, she says it's because he, John, is more focused on his career than her. Honestly, it's a perfectly valid reason to end a relationship with someone. But anyway, the flashback ends and we're back in the plane, but the seat Adam Booth's body had been in is now empty. John, having found a plane ticket to Greece in Booth's pocket beforehand, gets on that plane himself, but not before encountering Sarah at the airport. He didn't know she was going to be there, but we see Polly noticing this from a distance. She'd dropped John off, and it's a safe bet she doesn't know that.
Oh dear. What an awkward situation.
She almost certainly doesn't know Adam is dead either. Anyway, the two sit next to each other on the plane with pretty much every word coming out of Sarah's mouth compounding the situation. The tension builds as Sarah starts to feel stood up, and John spots someone trailing her, him, or possibly both. They also encounter an American couple, the husband of which drops hints to John that he's CIA, though he seems to think John is Adam. Well, this complicates things. The CIA agent, still thinking John is Booth, gives him a plane ticket and a hotel reservation to what I think is Sazan, an island off the coast of Albania, but geography isn't my strong suit. Once at the hotel, the CIA agent, named Parker, calls John downstairs, which leads to him being attacked and ultimately captured by 4 men who beat him pretty badly in the process. We see Parker witnessing this from a distance, but partially hidden and shaking his head, so I'm not sure if this was actually his idea. John wakes up in a chair where a Russian man asks him why he killed Booth, smacking him to the ground when he doesn't answer. Obviously, somewhere along the line, someone who knew what Booth actually looked like called it in. And apparently he'd already spilled how he killed Booth in a scene that wasn't filmed. Eventually, John caves and tells the Russian that he killed Booth because he found out Booth had been working for them. The Russian just smirks and we get another sparkly flashback as John comes to a horrifying realization. Booth was a double agent, but the other way around. The Russian interrogator reveals that they had learned that Booth had been playing them for years, feeding them ultimately useless information that caused them to waste millions of dollars on worthless projects. Their plan had been to assassinate Booth on his Athens vacation with his wife. Not gonna lie, this is a pretty good twist. John takes this about as well as you can expect. When the Russian interrogator tells him to follow outside and take a look in the garden, after demanding John help him get his hands on the research scientist from much earlier in the film, that would be Philip, he does so without putting up a fight. He looks and sees that the Russians have managed to nab Sarah. John goes along with this partly. It turns out that Philip, who also has a thing for Sarah, hadn't actually found Booth going through his papers when he got home. Booth had been going to confront him about something else, I forget. But Philip set John up to kill Booth with hopes of getting together with Sarah later. During the exchange, the Russian interrogator tells Sarah what John did to Adam and signals his henchmen to open fire. One of those henchmen being the guy who is the dead guy in the pool for the title image. But Parker and a team who have showed up at the house fire first, leading to all the bodies we saw at the start of the movie. We go from John and Philip tending to Sarah's arm to after the opening scene of the movie. John is staring out a window while Parker, Philip, and Sarah are sitting quietly. The implication being that in the interim, John has told Parker everything, or at least the parts he knew about directly. I'm tempted to use the "how did you know about the parts you weren't there for" clip, but I'm not sure it would actually work here. So after Parker and Philip leave, John and Sarah talk for a bit. The movie had shown us that Sarah and Adam's marriage had been on the rocks. But when she suggests that sometime in the future she and John could rekindle their past romance, John looks repulsed and leaves. Anyway, so remember the part earlier where I said that John said to her, either you didn't know or you didn't care? What did she not know or not care about? I mean, we're going to learn something later about Booth, but as it stands with the information we have in the movie now, that line just does not really make sense. That line would only make sense if Booth had been working for the Russians the whole time. And it also won't make sense in a minute. I'm going to get to that. We fade from Parker's car leaving the shootout scene to John returning to his hotel room, and Polly is there. I think she says why she knew where he was, but without closed captioning and with the combo of the accent and her talking so fast, I couldn't pick it up. John admits to having killed Adam. She takes this to mean she was right about him being a double agent, but John admits he was wrong about that and starts to tear up. We fade to the airport bar where John and Polly are sipping drinks, and boy, she's really taking in stride that her boyfriend murdered a guy. When the other old man from John's agency comes in, the guy who's not Vaughn Jones, okay, technically speaking, this does work narrowly. Narratively, not narrowly. How the hell did I miss that? I just don't care for it, and it also adds to the confusion of the line from the beginning of the movie. So yeah, Booth had been a Russian agent and all that, had been a double agent, he'd been feeding bad information to the Russians and all that, but he hadn't known that the information he had been given to give to that he had been giving to the Russians was bad. They had known he was a double agent and were feeding it to him. The reason the Russians were planning to kill him was because, okay, I'm really trying with this. So Vaughn Jones and the other guy knew that Booth was an agent, so they were feeding him bad information to give to the Russians. And then when relations between the Soviet Union and China fell apart, which was a thing that happened in real life, by the way, Booth sided with China. And, the other guy is telling John this. Now, if John had known that Booth had sided with China and all that before he talked to Sarah, then maybe the you didn't know or didn't care line would make sense. And, this movie's almost over. Let me just move on. Okay, so, in a sense, apart from his internal guilt, John is basically off the hook here. The other old man says he's hoping to offer John a promotion, and the movie leaves it ambiguous if he accepts or tells him to go fuck himself as we go into the credits. I will say it does clear up a few questions I had lingering after the revelation the Russian interrogator had given John, but, I have personally completely lost the plot at this point, so let's just get out of here. God, I hope anything I said during that last part before we go into the random thoughts made sense. Because a couple of the things I mentioned really only occurred to me as I was recording, so they weren't in the script. If I can even call it a script. It's really just a Google Doc. But, okay, random thoughts I had while watching the movie. This is why I am taking June and July off from the show, folks. Random thoughts I had while watching the movie. This movie has a PG rating from the MPA, formerly known as the MPAA, but it's a 1970s PG. 2. I'd say the use of flashbacks in this movie is more annoying than the use of narration in Man on a String. 3. There is a lot of smoking going on in this movie. I mean, a lot. It feels like it's a lot even for the time period. 4. At one point, the defecting Russian asks the American agent overseeing him if medical care is expensive in America. Oh, buddy, you have no idea. 5. I think the effect they were going for when John takes Booth out into a forest to kill him was to make it look foggy, but it ends up looking like the quality of the film print just suddenly declined. 6. For some reason, I kept calling Sarah Susan throughout my notes and had to go back and correct myself repeatedly. And 7. Colonel Scott. The other old man besides the one played by the criminologist from Rocky Horror was called Colonel Scott. No idea why I kept forgetting that, but Colonel Scott was the guy who told John that Booth had decided to side with China after the Sino-Soviet split. Final verdict. Ironically, pretty much every problem I have with this movie called The Executioner is how the filmmaking techniques it uses are executed. On their own, nothing this movie does is bad. Lots of great or even just plain good movies start in media res, or use flashbacks, or use visual signifiers to differentiate flashbacks from the main story, or use slow motion, or start at the end and then show us how we got there and so forth. But for the most part, this movie doesn't use any of those tools all that well. I mean, I've seen worse, and not just for this show either. This movie is competently made, mostly, but for a spy thriller, at least in my opinion, you need more than just competence in order to really hook your audience. And then there is the ending. Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it might have been better to end on John going home to face consequences for his actions rather than be told he was right all along, just not in the way he thought it was. He thought he was. Plot-wise, it fits. There's no reason that ending this story is inherently flawed, but it bugs me. Is there a name for that feeling when you're watching a movie and there's an aspect of it that isn't bad or confusing or offensive, but it still just doesn't sit right with you? Well, anyway, I guess if you're in the mood for a Cold War thriller that's actually a Cold War thriller, unlike at least half the movies on this set called Cold War thrillers, you could do worse than this. Just accept the fact that the flashback transitions are likely to remind you of Gen 1 My Little Pony. Come back next month when we do the Season 10 wrap-up episode, where I will be ranking all of these Cold War thrillers, with air quotes, and announcing the set chosen for Season 11. Have fun, stay safe, and free Palestine.